Yeah, it's hard to believe that it's already the point of the year that it is. All right, welcome. I'm excited to see all of you today, and I appreciate you coming. As I mentioned, I have a sneeze shield up this morning because I'm, I think, on the back end of a cold, and I'm more sensitive to exposing people to the cold now that we pay more attention with the pandemic. So, I apologize if I seem a little bit distanced, literally, but I think it's going to be an interesting class today. We'll see. One of the things that I remember coming up a lot, and you hear it mainly with taxes, but I came out of high school with a very vague understanding of the concept of interest rates. And I thought, why don't I ever have teachers talk to me about interest rates? So today we're going to talk about interest rates for a minute, and then I'm going to explain why it is that we are talking about interest rates and what relationship we have with our yield equation that we've been talking about. Dr. Kelly, you didn't happen to bring the little thing with you, did you? Ooh, cool. Bring that up here a second. Yeah. Yeah, put it on the.
Oh, okay. So, one of the projects that's coming up is we're going to be using these little ultrasonic sensors. But one of the facilities here at Texas Tech is a 3D printing lab in the library, and I thought it would be a nice complement to what we're doing in this class to give you some experience getting things 3D printed and using that laboratory. So over the weekend, I modified a special plant and soil science 5323 3D print.
He's got his own swag. Yeah.
Fits together. This was the version I printed over the weekend. I need to print it. Oh yeah. So now it.
Ooh.
So I haven't printed this using the lab yet. I need to do that before I ask you to go do it to make sure their tolerances are appropriate, so I don't have to go print stuff that doesn't work.
Right.
That's the plan. And so I'll provide you the file and you go to the lab and ask them. I'll take the printers that you need to update them.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Kelly. That was really cool stuff. So those of you online, he was, and I never know for 100% certain what's going to show up here, but he showed some 3D printing work that he had used to make a mount that could actually rotate with his ultrasonic sensor, which can be used for a number of applications in plant science, including plant height, plant width, etc. So really neat stuff. And, we're living in an age where a lot more things are possible, whereas, even 10 years ago, if we wanted to make a mount for one of these, if I'm selling these things, the first mount is probably going to cost about $2,000 or $3,000 to make. And then, once I'm selling 5,000 of them or 10,000 of them, the actual cost comes down and down and down to where it's, maybe $1 or $2 per sensor, because the materials are really inexpensive, but the actual design and testing that made it work the way that you want it to work is really the expensive part. So the first sensor of any kind that you make is always the most expensive, and then the cost gradually comes down toward equilibrium over the number that you sell. So back to interest rate. My wife and I are trying to decide whether to purchase a house right now, and we looked at a house that was right over by the Quaker farm. And then Dr. Kelly mentioned that he lives over by the Quaker farm. And I thought, you know, is there like a habitat distribution, kind of like grizzly bears, where you've got to have a certain amount of space between, you know, people who teach crop physiology at the university level? I don't know. Anyway, but one of the things that fascinates me about houses is, you know, right now we can get a 15-year loan for 2.5%, which is really good. I mean, we bought a house in Georgia and we were paying 4.5%, and we thought we were doing really good on it. But the thing that fascinated me about that was at 4.5% on a 30-year loan, you end up paying the same amount in interest over those 30 years as you pay in principal over those 30 years, which just blew me away because, you know, 4.5% seems really small, but, you know, essentially by the time you're finished buying your house, you've actually bought the equivalent of 2 houses. The purpose of this is not to scare you away from buying a house. You know, I realize many of you are millennials, so you're already scared away from buying a house. Am I allowed to say that? Is that politically incorrect? I mean, demographically, it's reasonably accurate, but
I think the issue with millennials is they're scared. It's that the wages aren't suitable in order to be able to live in a house.
Dr. Kelly sticking up for the millennials, saying, you know, it's the wages aren't great enough to buy a house. And here he's telling someone who had 7 children that, you know, other people aren't getting paid enough money. Nah, I'm joking. Anyway, so I thought it would be interesting to show a couple of different possibilities with interest rate and then tie that into our yield equation. So here is our typical number of dollars that you can produce. I put an interest rate of 3% here, compounded continuously. Sorry, it's pretty bad on a Monday morning when you can't remember the word continuously. And with starting out with a $10,000 principal, over time, what you see happen is this dramatic increase in value over longer periods of time. So over this period of time, and it turns out I was actually remembering the 15-year rate on that. Over time, if I bought a house for $10,000 and I was paying interest rate over that period of time, I would be paying more than double the price of this house. Now, keep in mind, you know, this number here overestimates it a little bit because you're paying down the principal over time. So this total amount doesn't quite track with this, but you end up generating a lot of money in interest over this period of time, even with a relatively small interest rate. And so one of the things that I was taught when I was growing up, which I completely ignored, but I can't say I wasn't taught it, was those who understand interest accrue it, and those who don't understand interest pay it. And the idea being that over time, if you're paying interest, you're paying a lot more in interest than you think that you're actually paying. So I thought it would be interesting. What would happen if instead of a 3% interest rate, I only had a 2.9% interest rate on this money? Yeah. And the reality is that even by just fractionally changing the interest rate over a long period of time, what you see is a divergence in these lines. And so, you know, on this top one here, let me see if I can get the arrow to show up. We are at 24,522. And at this one, we're at 23,799. So we've lost about $750 off of what looked like a marginal difference in terms of the quantity here. But wait, there's more. I also decided to try it. What if we maintain this 3% interest rate, but, you know, I'm not going to ask Dr. Kelly whether he's on the teacher's retirement or the optional retirement, but yes, yeah, yeah, learn from my mistake here. When I was at the University of Georgia, I started day one as a technician while I was working on my PhD, and I didn't have a choice on whether to do the optional retirement or the teacher's retirement. So they locked me into this teacher's retirement, which required 10 years to get vested in the system. And when I came here, I was at 8.5 years. So guess who got their money back without interest at the end of those 8.5 years? So when I came here, I said, yeah. So I said to myself when I came here, I don't know if I'm going to be at Texas Tech for 10 years. I don't know if I'm going to be at Texas Tech for 5 years. So I decided to go into the optional retirement program, which allows me at any time that I want to move universities and take that nest egg with me. And April 1st, 2021, I hit 10 years. So yeah, well, I think you still need 10. I think they upped it to 10, didn't they, just within the last 2 or 3 years? Anyway, whatever the case was, I could now be completely vested, and I'm not. Oh, well, okay. So turns out I've misinformed myself. I almost took another job after I'd been here for 3 years. I should have, just so that I could have said I made a wise decision on, on not, doing the teacher's retirement. But what happens if you have an investment that over the course of time, most of the time it's at 3%, but maybe you have a little bit of a drop in the system? So all I did here was I've got a 3% growth rate going along good. And then at about the 5-year mark, I have a little bit of a downturn in the market. Now I'm continuing to run off of this 3% the rest of the time. What effect does that have over the course of these 30 years with the same growth rate, but with that little dip right there? What you can see is that if we're maintaining the same growth rate, but we've got a drop off relatively early in the process, 5 years in the process, I've actually never completely recovered that, that dollar amount. In fact, I would have been better to just have a lower interest rate over the whole 30 years than to have that one period of time where it drops off and then have the same rate coming up. Now, markets are volatile. Just for example, back in 2019, 2020, I had periods of time where my optional retirement went up by 20%. And I've also had times where my optional retirement has gone down by almost that same amount as well. But it's volatile. Well, it turns out plants have a similar mechanism by which they produce yield. When you're talking about yield, you're talking about biomass accumulation and the conversion of that biomass into something that we as humans are able to sell. So I thought it would be interesting to show you a couple of possible ways that this could be impacted here. So what I did was I put together a percent yield using a standard 3-parameter sigmoid model, which I stole out of SigmaPlot and then plugged in my own numbers and played around with. And what you get with the sigmoid model is pretty similar to what you see with most crops, which is this. This should look pretty familiar because we were talking about it in terms of crop growth rate over the season. You have this period of time where you have exponential growth. You got this period of time where the growth is more or less linear. And then you've got a period of declining growth at the end of the season here. And, each of these makes sense. This is mostly meristematic growth, and the plant is mostly leaves, so it can increase in size very rapidly. This is the period of time where it's competing with other plants, and so it's in its best interest to produce as many leaves as possible, but it's also producing a lot of stems and roots. And this is the time where it's essentially investing everything that it can into the fruit in the plant. And so, when it's investing in the fruit, the overall growth starts to slow and slow and slow, because you can't be tearing down the ship and still be building the ship simultaneously. And that's what you see with the photosynthetic parts of the plant. Now, there are a few possibilities in terms of the types of effects that a parameter can have on your yield. One possibility that we often see is, let's say you've got a cotton plant, you have a short period of stress, and then that plant, once it gets back into the productive phase again, let's say you've got cold weather for about 3 or 4 days. Over time, that plant is delayed in what it does, but it is still able to essentially yield in a similar manner to what it did before. So an example of that would be this first one here. And all I did in this case was, let me show you this real quick. I decided to show you the first derivatives of each of these curves. And the first derivative is just how much did the biomass change by day over a period of time. So I have one case where we had a decrease, relatively small decrease, but it essentially affected the rest of the season. And we've got another one that we're going to play around with in a minute, where we've got a large decrease, but the plant's able to recover and is able to produce at a rate similar to what it was doing before after that event, and just see how these play around. So let's look at this small decrease first and see what happens. So the small decrease is that a gray line right here? Okay. I don't want to make a texture of it. So when you have something that affects actually that's the one where there's a short period of break off here. Here's the one where your growth rate is decreased over the period of time. What happens is, even though you only have about a 1 or 2%, I think I did about a 2% decrease in growth by day, what happens is that compounds upon itself. And so over time, you see a diverging line that is occurring here, and you never see the ability to come back to 100%. An example that we see a lot of times in our row crops is, if you get a crop that is water stressed, the photosynthetic rate does not dramatically decrease in terms of on a per leaf area basis, but the leaf area is decreased, and the plant doesn't immediately, in fact, many times it doesn't ever completely recover the leaf area growth rate that you had with that plant that was unstressed throughout the season. And so what you have is this compounding effect over the entire growing season. And so our unstressed plant in this case ended up getting up to almost 100%. Our stressed one ended up getting up to about 86%. So we've lost between 10 and 15% of our yield just off the fact that this effect kept penalizing us throughout the growing season. Now, if you're in a longer season environment, or if you're in a situation where plants are able to recover or compensate, sometimes that is a lot less dramatic. So in this case, I've got a period here where, in fact, let's do it for 5 days, or how many, that's about 8 days. So we've got a pretty big chunk here where the plant's not doing anything, but then it kicks back into gear and it's growing accordingly. What do you think is going to happen in this case? How many of you say this is probably going to be more dramatic than what we see with this gray line? How many of you say probably less dramatic? All right, well, let's find out. Best way to find out is to make a graph of it. And what you see is you see this drop off here, but over time, we see this plant essentially tracking with the unstressed plant over this period of time. And so the amount of loss that we have in this case is, minimal. That's 94% versus, is that also 94%? Yeah, 96%. So we lost about 2% of our yield here. Sorry, we lost about 2% of our yield here, and we maintained that loss of about 2% of our yield over the growing season here. All right, so what do you need to know about this? First of all, that plants are kind of like compound interest. And second, when we're talking about the yield equation, we're plugging in numbers in terms of radiation use efficiency, radiation capture, sunlight, etc. These values are these integrated values that we're getting over this long period of time, and they're not just a snapshot value that we're pulling out of the air. Granted, I'm pulling a lot of the numbers out of the air for purposes of this class, but when you're doing your own research, be aware that small impacts early in the season can have a relatively large impact on your final yield, or they might not, depending on whether they're an impact that's transient or an impact that is essentially incorporated into the life cycle of that plant. Questions? How many of you feel like you've learned something new and interesting that you weren't anticipating today? All right. Those of you online, no one raised their hands. I'm very disappointed. I'm kidding. So, yeah, that's a good point. It was said, I feel like if Kyle was here, he would be asking about the difference between the determinate and the indeterminate plants in this case. So because he's not here, let me throw out indeterminate versus determinate plants. So indeterminate crop, this is some work that was done in South Georgia by my advisor. And he was interested in, what effect does planting density have on the seed cotton yield of the plants? And so what they did was if you walk out to a typical field in West Texas, you're going to see somewhere usually between about 2 and 3 plants in every foot of row, roughly on average. So if we were doing that on a per meter squared basis, we'd be right here at about the 10.5 to 12.5 plants per meter squared, more or less. And so he decided, well, let's decrease it down to, in this case, it's essentially 1 plant per foot. And in this case, it's at, let's see, 23 divided by 3.25. I'm going to say that's about 6 plants per foot. So you've got a pretty wide spaced plants and pretty narrow spaced plants. And he said, what effect is this going to have on yield? And his general answer was, it turns out it didn't have much of an effect on yield. Our 2 largest numbers here, well, our largest number is right here at about the rate that we want it. Our other 2 largest numbers are at the very bottom and at the very top and the very bottom of the graph at the 2 extremes, and everything else was more or less just scattered within random variation here, which those of you online missed a great conversation by the class in general about how, if you actually know everything, is it random? My kids say that number one, they think that I'm a know-it-all, and number two, that what I say is random. So anecdotally, I would say, yes, it's still random, even if you think you know it all. But one of the things that made this possible with cotton was that it was an indeterminate crop. Not only could it produce fruit up the plant in order to compensate for planting density, it could also produce fruit going out from the middle of the plant. So you have plants that are spaced widely apart, they spread out and they put on a lot of fruit per plant. If you have plants that are very close together, they produce a lot of fruit right next to the stem and they grow straight up in what they do. With corn, when you do this planting density study, corn is extremely sensitive to planting density. In fact, this is brave of me because I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm guessing that if we go to Google Scholar and put in corn planting density, we're probably going to see 2,000 hits or better. Let's see, probably more, because it'll pull in some things by people with the last name of Corn who did work on density of something. Let's see, corn planting density. So 172,000 results right there. Yield responses to planting density for US modern corn hybrids, agronomic responses of corn to planting date and plant density, response of corn to planting pattern and density, and they're on. So cool thing is, if you're in agronomic research like Dr. Ritchie, you don't actually have to come up with any new ideas. All you've got to do is slap in such and such location, and you can essentially publish the same paper that someone else published. So, yeah.
Places where you can publish regional publications?
Yes. The question was, are there places you can publish these regional projects scientifically? Oh, yes. I mean, if you look through Agronomy Journal or Crop Science, there are a lot of projects that are regional in nature, where essentially they're going in and they're, you've got to describe why it is that your region is causing these results to be different as they're done. But everyone's kind of losing their respect for Dr. Ritchie. No one more so than Dr. Kelly in that answer. But the reality is, and again, it brings up an interesting question. Environment is a very fascinating factor. And in terms of a take-home message for people in West Texas, there's a lot of value to telling them what the cotton does in West Texas as opposed to what it does in Georgia, because if they planned off of expectations of what it's going to happen in Georgia, they're probably going to be disappointed, because Georgia has fewer heat units, it's got different soil type, it's got different irrigation systems, etc. Not to get distracted here. Well, I tell you, we're just all over the place today, huh? Let's see. We did this example on Friday, correct? What answers did everyone get for this, by the way? Were you at about 3,600 grams per meter squared per day? Oh, that's wrong. This should just be 3,600 grams per meter squared, because we're integrated over days. So that's the problem with letting something sit over the weekend, is you realize where you misled people. Whoa. I turned off the show and hide. Okay, so what does 3,600 grams per meter squared actually mean? And in here, we rounded a little bit differently, but it came out to 560 bushels of corn per acre. And for our example, we were probably only at like 530 or 540 bushels per acre, but that puts us way outside of what we would traditionally be able to grow in a 120-day growing season with corn. And the reality is, you never have, bless you, you never have perfect conditions when you're growing things out in the field. I found this interesting. I pulled this from a study from the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The world average yield for wheat is, that's what, about half a ton per hectare per year. The highest yielding country is Ireland, which has very nice growing conditions for growing wheat, which is cool and cloudy, believe it or not. The world record yield in a field when this was published was from New Zealand. And, they're up to maybe 2.5 tons per hectare per year, which is dramatically greater than the average yield and is even dramatically greater than the highest yielding country. But in experimental situations, and I saw this at Utah State, we were producing wheat in a greenhouse in a high density situation where we were getting yields that were probably 350 to 400 bushels of wheat per acre if you extrapolate it out to the size of a field. That would have been a world record. My brother, when he was doing his research in the same lab before me, said that they had some that went over 500 bushels to the acre when you extrapolate it out, which, if you could do that out in the field, you would, first of all, if you could do that within the context of a production system, suddenly, you could, you'd be selling the wheat for about 25 cents a bushel. But they've got simulated yields where they've actually said that, you can get it up to over, 100 tons per, sorry, I didn't look as closely as I should have at the axes here. This one's 10 times this. So this one was like 10, this one was like 15, this one was maybe 20. This one is about 70. The simulation gets us up over 100. And theoretically, if we took all of the maximum values at the cellular level and approach that in terms of wheat yield, you could theoretically be pushing 200 tons per hectare per year with wheat production. But we never have those maximum conditions here. So here's an example of just adding a little bit more realistic numbers here. We kept the same amount of light. Why did we keep the same amount of light even in a realistic situation? All right, it makes it easier to estimate, definitely. And as I mentioned, 20 million joules of light is an amount of light that we can consistently get in West Texas. So in this case, we can get that amount of light regardless of what our genetic potential is of the crop. We kept this the same, 50%, 100-day growing season. Our photosynthesis in this case dropped a bit because not all of the parts of our plant are going to be photosynthesizing. And over the course of the season, there's always going to be inefficiency associated with that. Same with the respiration. When you're having to feed parts of the plant that are not then in return returning photosynthate to you, such as the roots, which have a lot of respiration, and other parts of the plant and the fruit, having a 50% respiration efficiency is actually still pretty darn good. We kept everything else the same. Just with those minor changes, we went down from about 3,600 grams per meter squared to about 2,500 grams per meter squared. So in this case, we still have a bumper crop yield, 367 bushels per acre, which, if you're growing corn, if you're hitting 367 bushels to the acre, you're pretty excited about life, no matter where you are, unless you're trying to go for a world record corn yield. But, suddenly we've gone off of this maximum plateau where, you're getting your name up in the newspaper to, now you're making a good profit at the elevator instead. But what you need to remember is that, first of all, everything in this plant growth system, whether it's genetic, whether it's environmental, whether it's a management factor, is going to affect our yield equation in one or more places. And a lot of times, if we're trying to improve one of the components in the yield equation, we're going to be sacrificing another component of the yield equation. And so, as Mylea brought up last Wednesday, what about the fact that different parts of the plant environment have different quantities of light that are associated with them? If you pack your plants together really closely to try to maximize your radiation capture, you are also causing interplant competition. Your respiration efficiency goes down, your harvest index goes down, and if you're not careful, you're actually going to sacrifice yield in relationship to your final yield goal, as opposed to actually gaining yield. I've seen wheat that's been double planted that yielded about 50 bushels to the acre, and the rest of the field came out to about 95 bushels to the acre. Early in the season, the NDVI of that wheat was dramatically greater than the rest of the field, which would indicate that you're covering your rows up quickly and you're absorbing the maximum amount of radiation that plant can. But later in the season, the plants had fewer leaves, therefore they had fewer resources to put into the individual heads, and you ended up suffering on it. I have a few examples of things and their effect on the yield equation. Let's just kind of hop through this real quick. If your planting density is less than optimal, you're going to reduce your interception of light. As we showed in that other example, some plants are more sensitive than others. As Kyle likes to infer with an indeterminate crop, many times it can adjust for some of this. I wonder if Kyle's going to watch this. Be like, why is Dr. Ritchie bagging on me today? It's because he's not here.
I think that at least he'll be told.
Yeah, at least he'll be told. That's right. If you're at too high of a planting density, you might have excessive vegetative growth, but you're likely going to see a decrease in the production of seeds, and you're going to see a low harvest index. So you might be producing plenty of stem, plenty of leaf, but you run out of resources that you can put into the production of the actual seeds in this case. We ran through this already, but here are some examples. All right, what effects are these Colorado potato beetles going to have on our yield equation? Okay, so it was suggested the lack of leaves would decrease the photosynthetic rate, and so you're not going to have as many potatoes. Good answer, and that answer can actually be unpacked into a few different parts of this equation here. And I think it's worth at least bringing that up in terms of it doesn't affect the incoming sunlight, but it affects the absorption of incoming sunlight. So our absorption has just taken a major hit here, but that's not all. This plant spent resources making those leaves in the first place, and now those leaves are no longer existent. So it put a lot of energy into respiration, and it also had a lot of photosynthesis that was going into respiration. And suddenly this has been dramatically decreased as well. So your radiation use efficiency has also been substantially decreased, Mylea. Ah, good Good question. The question was, I know with some plants, when they get chewed on by insects, they stop putting their energy into growth and they start putting it into protective chemicals within the plant, whether it be enzymes or, things that taste bad, things that to fight back against the insects. Would that also affect this radiation use efficiency? Yes, because respiration is being used, but it's not being used toward growth. It's being used toward a protective structure. So we're getting dinged on a lot of areas of this equation here. Now, if the plant is having to expend more and more resources to try to shore up its vegetative growth, your harvest index might also be affected. So you've got all of these direct and downstream effects that are affecting the growth and the viability of this plant over time. Here's another example of an insect pest, this corn earworm. What do you think this is primarily having an impact on? Yeah, harvest index. Also, we're removing biomass from the system. So you could also make the argument that, you've got a decrease in radiation use efficiency, but, causes you some big problems. Not only that, it causes you some quality problems as well. Here's a boll weevil, which I was informed by an entomology student that I had. They do not suck on the bolls. They actually chew on the bolls, but they're really bad little insects because they feed off of one boll while it's at a sensitive stage, and they eat a little bit and then they move to the next one and they eat a little bit. So one insect can actually knock several fruit off of your plant. And, boll weevils, back in the 1900s could cause 80 to 90% yield losses on your cotton crops. And they were almost single-handedly able to remove cotton production in many areas of the United States. If you look in Georgia, all of the cotton production in Georgia is in deep South Georgia now, whereas in 1905, you saw cotton production all the way from the southern border of Georgia in a direct line all the way up into South Carolina and North Carolina. But instead, people got out of the business of cotton production, and then they never got back into the business because it was a losing proposition for them. Drought stress is interesting, and I showed you an example of an impact of drought stress when I was showing you the Excel file here. This one here, where a decrease during an early period of the season. Oops. Did I not? Okay, there we go. This decrease just keeps on giving over the period of time here. Now, keep in mind that if you have a plant that gets stressed later in the season, sometimes it's not necessarily a bad thing that it has decreased its growth rate early in the season, because maybe you're going along unstressed on the top here. Let's say, let's see, we planted on June 1st this year on a lot of our stuff. When did we start getting the real dry weather? About August 15th? Maybe, okay, August 20th. So that would give us 30 in June, 31 in July, we'll say 20 in August. So that's what, 81 days? So let's just say at 81 days, and I'm not saying that this happened exactly here, but let's just say that you get a major drought event like we had in 2020. And oops, I did it on both of them here, but I guess I should have done it this way. Let's say that you don't accumulate any more yield after that point. That's a pretty dramatic effect. But in this case, and I have this number 2 linked to the control. Ideally, I would have these unlinked from each other, but if you have something dramatic that happens, a hail event, or some dramatic stress that occurs, even though this plant is super happy here, it goes from really happy to dead really fast, and you don't produce any more after that point. Whereas plants that have adapted themselves to some level of stress sometimes come out ahead in those cases. So just be aware that there are some impacts on that end. What time is it? Okay, this should be just about perfect then. One of the interesting things is, because everything that impacts our yield impacts a part of our yield equation, you can actually do alternative yield equations that can highlight some limiting factor. So this is something that we use a lot with my research, which focuses around irrigation management and plant water stress. So we can actually change this yield equation, and instead of focusing strictly on radiation capture, why don't we focus on the quantity of water that we have available to us during the season? And if we're able to get a reasonable calculation of water use efficiency, you can do exactly the same thing with water as you do with radiation capture. And the cool thing is, if we find ways to change the water use efficiency, we can keep everything else exactly the same and estimate what fractional yield gain or loss we have based on a management system. You can also do that with a limiting factor such as nitrogen. In this case, we actually did a research project with Dr. Lewis where we were looking at partitioning of carbon and nitrogen. And we used this general conceptual model of nitrogen uptake and efficiency to show how, compared to a cultivar of cotton from about 20 years ago that we grew next to the modern cultivars, we had greater uptake efficiency and use efficiency, which therefore turned into a greater yield with the same resources of nitrogen that we had previously. Should I show this or should I not show this? I may have time. Okay.
I think you should share that paper with the class.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, and by a really cool paper that I did, a really cool paper that Irish did. Let's see. That should get us there. All right. If you go to Google Scholar and if you put Pabion partitioning, here is an entire paper that is essentially using the yield equation to describe the effects of improved partitioning toward improved yield. And I've got to say, I'm still kind of a kindergartner in that when I see cool colors, I get excited about them. But one of the things that she did was she actually measured the partitioning being broken out into different parts of the plant over the growing season. So you can actually see not only how much nitrogen's in the plant, but where did that nitrogen actually go into the plant? And what we found was that we were actually moving a larger fraction of nitrogen into the parts of the plant that we could sell and leaving the rest of the plant with less nitrogen in it. So, that's something my kids strive for in terms of, their goal is to leave their parents with as little in the bank as possible so that it can be partitioned to them, over the life cycle of their parents. All right. Any last moment questions before we break? We're going to have a brief on on Wednesday. We're going to briefly talk about the yield equation in relationship to breeding efforts. We'll look at a few model crops, and then we will move on to the next stage. Thanks, everyone. Oh, what's that? Ah, that would be a good question. I know yeah. Thank you. Have a great afternoon or great rest of the morning.